Well, hello everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. It's September 18th, 2023, a few minutes after 11 a.m. And gee, I never did get that hair straightened, did I? Oh, well, oh, I apologize for my unkempt looking hair. I tried, bad hair day. Anyway, it's all good. It's all good. Hope you had a good weekend. I had a very restful weekend full of a lot of study, working on things I've learned from Nick Petoskey, Karma Doc, our good friends Carol and Tara and Kathy Sue and so many others about the alternative treatments available for my condition, whatever you want to call it, and working also on pulling weeds outside, trying to make the garden look better. And but we've still got some sunflowers that are still got some nice, beautiful flowers on them. So not time to turn everything under quite yet here on Mystery Island. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, I thank you. I say I'm looking well. I'm feeling well. I'm feeling just fine. Absolutely no problems at all. Been doing these alternative treatments now for some of them for 2 months, others less than that, but no side effects that I can report. So feeling pretty good. Well, I've been telling you guys for some time I wanted to do a little mutual study of Jane Addams with you. And to do that, I'm going to rely on an academic article that I just happened upon. You know, a person of my, set of mind right now, I don't like progressivism generally. I think it's just been used and abused and doesn't work in this particular economy. Maybe someplace else, but it's a problem because it has produced a lot of progress over the 20th century. And that's undoubtedly a good thing. So, what about the Hall House, settlement house idea? It produced some things that are looked down upon. I mean, really, if you dig into it, you'll see that they were very much allied with some darker side of this New World Order stuff. And we'll explore that too in this article. I also want to point out that we've been thinking about the Fabians and how they are creeping in to our world. And so I think that you can see up over my shoulder, that there is, up here, this shoulder. See how they creep in? So that's that Fabian turtle, and we've still got a good barrier between him. We've got, American flags. We've got our angel. We've got my dad. We've got the raven there, and and our glass eagle, our glass seagull to remind us of the importance of glass steagall. So I think we're in good shape still, but we have to keep in mind that they're creeping. They're creeping. The turtle is going to pounce one day, and that's what we need to be ready for. So let's break down some of this stuff because another introduction to this essay is that I want to make is this. It's a mystery to me how the Democratic Party of the 19th century, you know, um, the absolutely racist, Jim Crow, South will rise again, how they managed to become the Democratic Party of progressivism, of the ACLU, of the SCLC, of all the Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and all the truly wonderful progress that has been made against the tide of existing elite control. But how did they get from being the most racist party in the country to being the party most respected as anti-racist? How did they get that? So listen to the story here. And for me, a lot of light bulbs went off when I read this. I've actually read it twice to myself to get a real good handle of it. So this will be my third time. It's a article in the Illinois Historical Journal, Volume 90, Number 1, Spring of 1997, page 47 to 64. It's 18 pages long, so I hope I can do the entire article this morning and maybe have time to make some comments at the end. Now, I am going to share the screen so that you guys can see it. This is an article that I've got on JSTOR. JSTOR is a very prolific provider of scholarly articles. It's just wonderful if you get access to it. And what a lot of people don't know is you can have free access to it and get almost all of the articles for free just by signing up for it. You get 100 free articles. So this is a free article, but it's not very accessible unless you sign up. So you may want to study it yourself later, and you can do that by pausing the video. Okay, looking good, and we'll get started. Forerunners for a Domestic Revolution, Jane Addams, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and the Ideology of Childhood, 1900 to 1916, by Robert Thornton Grimm, Jr. Laura Jane Addams and Charlotte Perkins Gilman met for the first time in 1894. Gilman mentioned the encounter in her diary on January 20th of that year. Quote, Jane Addams is coming, wants to start some organization for working women, unquote. During the 1890s, the two women gained national prominence, and their early meetings must have gone well, for in 1896, at the invitation of Addams, Gilman spent many months at Hull House, the Chicago settlement house that brought Addams much of her national fame. Okay, let me make a footnote here so that we understand that Hull House was something that she is given credit for inventing. But if you read Philip Drew Administrator by Edward Mandel House, which is published, I think, in 1912, it indicates maybe earlier than that. But anyway, the mindset of Jane Addams to create a settlement house fits exactly with the mindset of Edwin Mandel House, the racist intimate of Woodrow Wilson, whose heritage is completely Southern Texas plantation owner and slave owner. That guy, he comes up with, in his book, the idea of creating these settlement houses, so that the poor people would have a place that they would always be able to sleep and get a good meal and perhaps learn some trades or learn sanitary conditions were really the big problem, I think, back then. So it was a huge problem. And Edward Mandel House wanted to address it by creating this settlement house idea. So, without mentioning him in this article, Jane Addams comes up with the same idea. Well, they run in the same circles, as you'll see. After that stay, Gilman returned to Hull House numerous times while on lecture tours around the country. According to her diary in the summer of 1897, she had discussions with Addams on the economic relationship of the sexes. Those discussions helped solidify the ideas that she expressed in her famous work, Women and Economics. Gilman wrote, quote, "A good morning. Talk with Miss Addams. She is really impressed with a new big idea. To have her see it is a great help." The two women spent the next decade and a half, the Progressive Era, producing a large number of works. They both tended to focus on children, which was a logical extension of the work of the most prominent woman and female intellectual of the previous generation, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the co-initiator of the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. Stanton's biographer, Lois W. Banner, wrote, quote, "Cady Stanton was a radical for her age. Few feminists have gone beyond her vision of the amphiarchate and an androgynous society in which roles and responsibilities are assigned by ability and interest and not by sex, in which power is shared equally by men and women, and in which all sex stereotyping is eliminated in the raising of children." Cady Stanton realized that radical implications of such ideas when she wrote it in 1868, that it was not the ballot alone that women needed, but instead, quote, "a revolution in society, politics, and religion," unquote. Now, I'm going to take a breath here and say, wait a minute. Did you see that? This is woman in 1848, the Seneca Falls Conference, um, has a vision of the amphiarchate, an androgynous society in which roles and responsibilities are assigned by ability and interest and not by sex, in which power is shared equally by men and women, and in which all sex stereotyping is eliminated in the raising of children. Addams and Gilman, two women not commonly seen as historically parallel in their intellectual orientations, actually held congruent ideas on the topic of children. Addams and Gilman's comparable life experiences and their exchange of ideas during the 1890s culminated in their common theory about children during the Progressive Era. Although they expressed it in different words, Addams and Gilman shared startlingly similar views on children, particularly children's mentality. Both agreed about the fundamental nature of children, the stifling effect of gender roles on children, and the proper role of parents. Both shared a common vision for children's education that incorporated their beliefs about the purpose of humanity. And despite historians' attempts to call one an ideological counterpoise to the other, both women called for such radical changes in the way that American children were raised that their writings on children were nothing short of a call for a domestic revolution. The study of American childhood stands as one of the newest areas of inquiry in historical scholarship. Such historians of childhood as Joseph M. Hawes have concluded that the Progressive Era, The period from about the turn of the 20th century to America's entrance into World War I was the great watershed so far as social policy toward children and children's rights were concerned, quote unquote. Children gained a prominent place on the American social agenda for the first time because of the increasing public role of women. According to historian Linda Gordon, quote, social reform had a female character in the progressive era because motherhood represented, quote, women's claim to respect and power, unquote. Gordon defines that claim as, quote, maternalist feminism, unquote, or an ideology of, quote, putting children first. Maternal feminists saw children as the way to transform American society, a view that historian Hawes supports when he states that at the end of the 19th century there arose a group that he called the child savers, whose romantic view of children was evidenced through their belief that children, quote, were morally superior to adults, unquote. Hawes also wrote that within America a movement grew towards, quote, scientific philanthropy, unquote. That term represented social workers and volunteers' desires to professionalize their work by creating a formal educational program. Their task, quote, had become so complicated that it required training, unquote. Contemporary scholars Granville Stanley Hall, Thomas Edmund Dewey, and Sigmund Freud prepared studies of children based upon the scientific tradition. Their works helped perpetuate confidence that, quote, the best interest of the child, unquote, was held by the experts. The best interest of the child is held by the experts. That's Freud, okay? And I actually had to read a book when I was at Georgetown Law School. And I studied family law, and I had to read a book called Beyond the Best Interest of the Child. And this, of course, was all about custody. And, can the state take a child? So this issue is burning, right now when we face these mandates. Scientific studies, it was believed, would provide the knowledge that reformers needed to bring their vision of a better future to fruition. Progressive era experts, writes historian Ronald D. Cohen, were concerned with, quote, broken and inadequate families, health, delinquency, morality, poverty, schooling, dependency, and neglect, employment, discrimination, adolescence, recreation and play, and early child development. Adults worried about children, everybody's children, not just their own, out of fear for the country's future, unquote. Despite a tremendous range of concerns, historians have produced only a small number of works on specific aspects of childhood during the Progressive Era. David Nassau examines children's consumption of 5-cent theaters, concluding that the films, quote, carefully and successfully walked the fine line between offending the reformers and boring the children, unquote. Victoria Bissell Brown analyzed municipal sex role socialization, showing that compared to boys, urban girls lacked, quote, opportunities to roam and to explore the public world of adults, unquote. Brown concludes that those girls' quote, adoption of feminine characteristics early in life was due more to early social influences than theorists of child development at the time could recognize. Ruth M. Alexander studied the life of, quote, wayward girls, female youths who increasingly entered this urban workforce at the turn of the 20th century because of their family struggles to, quote, remain economically stable. She demonstrates that those, quote, previously sheltered teenage girls, unquote, often encountered within the context of city modern mores, quote, social rituals that celebrated feminine allure and heterosexual romance, the autonomy of youth, and the purchase of fun, unquote. That puts it rather succinctly, doesn't it? That code of values ran counter to the Victorian morals of adults, a conflict that often resulted in, quote, modern girls, unquote, finding themselves placed in reform schools. There's a picture of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Yeah, all of these names are all New England, you know, first families, huge wealth. Doesn't mean these individuals are wealthy. It just means that the family has a huge, huge history of building wealth in the United States. Addams usually has been relegated to a footnote or a passing quote by childhood historians, while Gilman has virtually remained absent from the corpus of scholarly works on American children. Yet both Addams and Gilman can be seen as part of the maternal feminism movement, as they wished to create a better future through children, and they believed in the quote innate goodness unquote of children. So do I. They never reconciled themselves, however, to the belief of many progressives, no doubt influenced by Freud. Freud, yes, hello, Freud, that children were, quote, innately depraved, unquote. Yeah, kind of a Catholic idea, too, isn't it? Further, both condemned the constraints of gender stereotyping, and Addams denounced the 5 cent theater and the modern city's sexual exploitation of working girls. Past work, however, has focused more upon child theorists' ideas about children. Therefore, exploring Addams and Gilman's ideas on children advances the new field of American childhood history. For it was Addams and Gilman's life experiences that formed their views on the changes needed in children's lives. As prominent reformers, Addams and Gilman joined the ongoing debate about progressive era children. They were exact contemporaries. Both were born in 1860 and died in 1935. Both originated from old and well-known Northeastern families. Adams's ancestors had initially been given land by William Penn. Her father, John Huey Adams, immigrated to Illinois from Pennsylvania in 1844 and became a prosperous businessman, community leader, and a friend of Abraham Lincoln. He served 8 terms as an Illinois state senator. Likewise, Gilman could trace her ancestors back to the days of Roger Williams. Gilman's father, Frederick Beecher Perkins, a member of the famous New England Beecher family, his grandfather was Lyman Beecher and his aunt was Harriet Beecher Stowe, was a librarian and magazine editor. Soon after Charlotte's birth, Perkins left his wife and family and hardly ever visited or supported them. 13 years later, he obtained a divorce. Gilman did not grow up in one home like Adams because of her parents' estranged relationship. She lived in as many as 19 different places in New England during the first 18 years of her life, usually in the houses of relatives. As for siblings, Adams was the eighth of 9 children, but only 4 lived to maturity. Gilman was the fourth of 4 children, 2 of whom lived to maturity. Adams was 2 when her mother died. While she grew up idolizing her father for the fervor of his moral integrity, she never grew emotionally close to her stepmother, Anna Haldeman Adams. Gilman's relationship with her parents was little better. Her father made infrequent visits, and her mother purposely did not show any love to her children in the hope of sparing them disillusionment later in life. Gilman's mother caressed her daughter only when she believed her to be asleep, leading Gilman to feign sleep, resorting to sticking herself with pins in order to stay awake for her mother's embraces. Unbelievable, isn't it? In their early life, both Adams and Gilman coincidentally experienced an illness that brought them to seek the help of the famous Philadelphia physician Silas Weir Mitchell. Adams's illness was a disabling spinal condition, while Gilman suffered from spells of nervousness. Gilman began experiencing those spells which made her unable to conduct household duties within weeks of her May 2nd, 1884 marriage to Walter Stetson. The birth of their only child, Catherine, on March 23rd, 1885, increased her despondency to the point that she spent entire days crying on a couch. Consequently, a nurse and then Gilman's mother took up the care of Catherine. Stetson sent her to see Mitchell, who prescribed his famous rest cure, which, as her well-known, largely autobiographical short story, quote, "The Yellow Wallpaper," quote, unquote, shows, drove her close to insanity. A recuperation trip to California away from her husband resulted in a partial recovery. Her improved health ultimately convinced her to separate from her husband and move with Catherine to California permanently. Gilman was granted a divorce from Stetson in 1894. Soon after, Stetson married Gilman's closest friend, Grace Channing. Just before their wedding, Gilman sent Catherine to live with the couple. She believes that action was justified because Channing was constitutionally better fitted to the task of mothering. Nevertheless, Gilman's action was widely reviled by the society of the day. Many people called her an unnatural mother. The charge haunted Gilman all her life and greatly influenced her belief that the way Americans raise their children needed to be changed. During the 1890s, Gilman emerged as a national figure. She gained some fame with The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892, and then she built on that notoriety with other works of prose and poetry. Having attained a reputation as a persuasive speaker, she traveled around the country giving lectures on the need to change the behavior of men and women. Gilman stayed for a period at Hull House, and later she spent several months at Unity Settlement, a newly opened social settlement located in Little Hell on Chicago's North Side. As a mark of Addams's growing esteem for her friend, she asked Gilman to open and direct that settlement. Gilman, who still had nervous spells from time to time, did not feel up to the task. Instead, she deferred the first directorship of the settlement house to her good friend, Helen Stewart Campbell. For the rest of the decade, Gilman's fame grew concurrently with an interest in socialism, an ideological evolution that was largely spurred on by her reading of Edward Bellamy's classic utopian novel of the American Fabian movement. Yes, there he is. Looking Backward is the name of Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, a novel published 1888. Believing that collectivist living was the way of the future, she promoted that view in her works, especially in The Forerunner, a journal that she founded, edited, and completely authored from its inception in 1909 to its conclusion in 1916. Jane Addams also rose to national prominence in the 1890s. In 1882, she graduated at the head of her class from Rockford Female Seminary in Rockford, Illinois. Addams's father had already instilled in her the idea of civic duty, and her Rockford experience honed the notion of duty to others. Just as travel helped Gilman, Addams's health benefited from extended tours of Europe. In London, she studied urban poverty for the first time. She saw the settlement impulse of Toynbee Hall, a movement of young college students working to improve the lives of people suffering the bitter consequences of rapid industrialization. In 1889, along with former Rockford classmate Ellen Gates Starr, that's Starr, an interesting name to many people, she opened Hull House with the idea of copying Toynbee Hall's mission. So she got it from London, okay? Addams started the settlement house in a decaying mansion located within a poor immigrant area of Chicago. She believed that privileged young people, especially young women like herself, needed a connection with the realities of life. Settlement work, she believed, mutually benefited the settlement workers and the underprivileged members of the community that they helped. From its inception, Hull House mainly responded to the immigrant community's needs. By 1893, the settlement provided nursery services as well as cooking and sewing courses. Soon, it expanded to include not only the original mansion, but also an art gallery, gymnasium, dispensary, playground, cooperative boarding house, little theater, and a music school. During the 1890s, Hull House attracted many people to its cause, including such noted social reformers as Florence Kelley, who served as secretary of the National Consumers League from 1899 to 1932, and Julia Clifford Lathrop, who served as the first head of the Federal Children's Bureau in 1912. Gradually, Hull House workers saw the need for more than just neighborhood services, and with the 1895 publication of Hull House Maps and Papers, a sociological investigation of conditions in Chicago's 19th Ward, they charted a new direction for Hull House. That examination exposed tenement conditions, sweatshops, and child labor. Armed with those studies, Hull House workers helped create the first Factory Inspection Act in Illinois and battled for child labor laws, limitations on working hours for women, protection of immigrants, compulsory school attendance, and industrial safety legislation. The establishment of the nation's first juvenile court in Chicago in 1899 was largely the result of Hull House's activism. True to the spirit of the age, Addams and Gilman wrote on a variety of topics that they saw as improving the lives of children. Addams mainly discussed children of immigrant and poor families, who were most familiar to her from her work. While Gilman sometimes specifically cited immigrant and poor families, she often wrote in more general terms about children from every socioeconomic background. In order to examine Adams's and Gilman's reforms as they related to children, their visions of the mentality of children must be examined. Adams and Gilman believed that most American adults did not understand children at all. I think they were right, don't you? They shared the conviction that children had a special, separate intellect that was different from adults. Armed with that understanding, they were certain that they could ameliorate the lives of children. One of the most important things that Adams believed people needed to know was that children had a, quote, spirit of adventure, unquote. She also believed children became involved with vices like guns, drugs, and alcohol because, quote, they liked the excitement and the fun of it, unquote. She saw the city as a place that overstimulated the senses of children who had not yet learned restraint. She noted that the modern child was cruelly exposed to, quote, all that is gaudy and sensual by the flippant street music, the highly colored theater posters, the trashy love stories, the cheap heroics of the revolvers displayed in the pawn shop windows, unquote. You know, the digital media of the day, of our day, is exactly the same as the experience she saw through posters, revolvers, gaudy and sensual music. One of the principal targets in those, let's see, Adams told many stories of how the city led children to debauchery. One of the principal targets in those stories was what she called the House of Dreams, a 5-cent theater. She recounted that 3 boys who had recently seen a movie showing the robbing of a stagecoach and the lassoing of the driver had then, quote, spent weeks planning to lasso, murder, and rob a neighboring milkman. They made their headquarters in a barn and saved enough money to buy a revolver. One spring morning, the conspirators with black cloth lay, quote, in ambush, unquote, for the milkman. As the lariat was thrown, the horse shied, and although the shot was apparently fired, the milkman's life was saved, unquote. Adams's stories expressed her point that certain temptations, such as guns, alcohol, and drugs, were traps into which children, quote, so habitually fall that it is evident that the average child cannot withstand them, unquote. As a solution, she proposed statewide legislation to safeguard the streets. Her immediate effort was to create the Juvenile Protection Association. That group of adults, for example, previewed films at the 5-cent theaters and persuaded theater owners to provide lectures, quote, on public health and morals, unquote, that were, quote, entertaining as well as instructive, unquote. Boy, you talk about a difficult task. She also suggested building playgrounds and parks as a way to allow children's spirit of adventure to be expressed in a positive manner. Well, I do too. I mean, I, yeah, why aren't we building? Oh, well, I mean, there's so much of what she's saying that I agree with. And it's obscured by her reputation as someone who enabled a lot of the Fabian, intrusion into our system. But I don't know for sure who said the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but these are great intentions. But look how people have twisted them into, just bizarre creatures that are threatening children. Another part of children's mentality that Addams described was benevolence, a desire, quote, to improve the world, to bring about juster social conditions, unquote. She argued that through school and college, all youths, quote, dream of self sacrifice, of succor to the helpless, and of tenderness to the unfortunate, unquote. According to Adams, that spirit was not expressed because child labor in factories had eroded it. Child labor was, quote, prematurely using up the strength which really belongs to the next generation. It also caused children to get involved in vice. For instance, she told stories of girls returning from a tiring day of work in a factory who were, quote, decoyed into a saloon where the soft drink was followed by an alcoholic one containing knockout drops. And they, quote, awoke in a disreputable rooming house, unquote. Adams believed that child labor was destroying children's innate benevolence. Additionally, their spirit of adventure, which they presumably could not help having, involved them in the vices of the city streets. Like Adams, Gilman noted a similar spirit of adventure in the children of the Progressive Era. For her, children had a, quote, passionate hunger for change, an eager, intense interest in stories of anything and everything as far removed from home and home life as possible, a longing for something to happen, unquote. I absolutely identify with that in my childhood. She also noted that children were, of course, naive about many things in their world, as Adams viewed the city streets as places that exploited children's inexperience. Gilman, there's Jane Addams for you. Sorry, let me catch this. Gilman viewed the home in a similar manner. She described the child's ingenuous state of mind. Quote, the child at home has no knowledge of any other and better environment wherewith to compare, unquote. She then pointed out how that naivete affected various aspects of a child's life. For example, she described at length children's lack of knowledge about the importance of nutritional value. Hello, ding, ding, ding. In their food. Gilman wrote, quote, the young stomach is adapted to its food supply. It grows accustomed to it and, quote, likes, unquote, it. One ghastly exception should be taken to this smooth statement. I have said that, quote, the young stomach is adapted to its food supply. Alas, alas, that this is true of those who survive. But think of the buried babies and question if some part of that awful death list is not due to our criminal ignorance of what is proper food. unquote. Gilman also saw many things in children's lives that they could not control. Therefore, they needed adult help. As the Juvenile Protection Association looked out for the proper health and well being of children, Gilman wanted individuals like cooking specialists in the home who would provide children with appropriate food in order to guarantee their health and well being. Further, she saw a need for playgrounds and parks where children could allow the spirit of adventure to be expressed positively. Quote, why not provide for them a place where their natural activities would not be injurious? Like Addams, Gilman recognized the existence of a benevolent nature in children. Quote, every healthy child delights in work for the common good. She believed that children naturally wished to improve the world, to make life better for all. She particularly pointed out that the environment as a place where children wished to make the environment as a place where children wished to make improvements. Now, this again is another reference to the essay, the goodness of the intention of supporting the children by praising and drawing out their desire to to improve the environment, right? And this is 100 years ago that she's writing this, more than that. So where does this fit with Greta Thunberg? Do you see what I'm saying? They read Gilman and they read Addams and they read Freud and they read all of these shrinks and they said, you know what? The way to sell climate change is through children because children want to improve the environment. Where'd you learn that? Oh, I learned it from Charlotte Gilman Perkins. Pardon me. Gilman told a story about grandchildren asking their grandfather, quote, please plant sugar maples. Maple sugar and maple syrup ought to be so plenty and so cheap that we could all have enough, unquote. I love this, you know? Yeah, Grandpa, why don't you plant some more sugar maples? Well, it's not going to do good down here in the South, but in the right environment, it's free food. Come on. According to her, if, quote, humanity were perfectly healthy, we should see each young human being coming eagerly forward to do his share of the world's work without, quote, being under the action of personal desire, unquote. Rather than excoriating child labor as Addams did, Gilman accused general unhealthiness for restricting children's innate benevolence. Both women also strongly addressed gender stereotypes in their writings, including the idea that children were proscribed by gender. Historian Joan Wallach Scott has defined gender as, quote, a way of denoting, quote, cultural constructions, unquote, the entirely social creation of ideas about appropriate roles for women and men. It is a way of referring to the exclusively social origins of the subjective identities of men and women, unquote. Well, that's a controversial thing to a lot of people, isn't it? The early 20th century was still largely representative of the Gilded Age ideology of separate spheres for men and women. Separate spheres was a social assumption that men were supposed to be independent and work in the world, while women were supposed to be dependent and work in the home. Addams and Gilman showed how those gender definitions adversely affected children's lives. Adams's discussion of gender primarily focused on girls as she attacked a detrimental social assumption that females should spend most of their lives within the home. She believed that this proscription induced girls to be dependent upon others instead of being autonomous individuals aware of the ways of the world. Separate spheres caused females to make poor choices in youth and adulthood. One example of how societal gender definitions harmed many women was marriage. The girl, dependent upon her parents in the home, became the housewife, unable to exist without her husband. Adams saw that subordination as dangerous because it often manifested into an extreme devotion towards the spouse, and such dependency could lead to a miserable fate. To clarify her point, Adams related an account of a man who came to her because his wife was in a state prison. She reported that one day while the man was getting a tooth pulled, he became intoxicated, and as he and his wife passed a rack, he stole an overcoat and was immediately arrested. The wife, quote, insisted that she had been an accomplice, and together they were put in the county jail. The young wife told her husband that she made up her mind to swear that she had stolen the overcoat. What could she do if he were sent to prison and she were left free? From that time on, they stuck to the lie through the indictment, the trial, and her conviction. Thus had an illiterate, neglected girl, through sheer devotion to a worthless sort of young fellow, inclined to drink, entered into that noble company of martyrs. Unquote. As for those girls who worked outside the home, Adams wanted them to be allowed to keep more of the money that they earned, which would give girls lessons in finance and make them more independent. Those kinds of lessons, however, never occurred for the majority of girls. Quote, in a recent investigation of 200 working girls, it was found that only 5% had the use of their own money, and that 62% turned in all they earned. Related to that rigid control of girls' wages and lack of independence was prostitution. Quotes, discouraged and over-fatigued, they are often brought into sharp juxtaposition with the women who are obtaining much larger returns from their illicit trade. All the statistics of prostitution give the largest number of recruits for this life as coming from the domestic service, and the second largest number from girls who live at home with no definite occupation whatever. For Adams, gender roles led to the impairment or ruin of a large portion of the female population, and for that reason she advocated change in gender-specific constructs. Again, we're talking 100 and some years ago, 110, 20 years ago. Gilman also found the contemporary gender roles injurious to girls. Like Adams, she viewed the home as associated with perpetuating the gender-specific ideology of separate spheres. Boys were supposed to be in the world, and girls were supposed to be in the home. Quote, the home teaches the boy that women were made for service, domestic service, that the principal cares and labors of life are those which concern the body, and that his own particular tastes and preferences are of enormous importance. Unquote. The consequence of this pedagogy is that girls learned a dependent worldview and boys learned an independent one. Quote, the world is the real field of action for humanity. So far, humanity has been well nigh wholly masculine, and the boy, feeling his humanity, pushes out into his natural field, the world. He learns all about all sorts of machinery, all manner of trades and businesses. If he is in the city, he knows the city. If he is in the country, he knows the country, far more fully than his sister. 1,000 influences reach him that never come to her, formative influences, good and bad, that modify character. The world is cut off from the girl. Girls who were deprived of the world and taught a dependent outlook also resulted, according to Gilman, in young women whose, quote, ideals are all of devotion to the lover and husband. This, quote, innocence, unquote, does not enable her to choose a husband wisely. She does not even know the dangers that possibly confront her. Finally, like Addams, Gilman denounced gender roles because they were, quote, arresting the development of half the world. We have a world wherein men industrially live in the 20th century and women industrially live in the first century and back of it, unquote. Parental roles also needed reform. Addams and Gilman were concerned about and suggested changes for the role of parents. Both women predicted that such changes would improve the lives of children. One of the major parental actions they assailed was forcing children to work in factories. At the turn of the century, the United States Bureau of Census reported that there were 161,276 children under the age of 16 engaged in industrial factory work. Many of the parents of those children were immigrants who did not know the English language and the culture of the United States as well as their children did. For that reason, Adams professed, they often found that it was easier for their children to get work outside of the home than it was for themselves. That progenitor behavior resulted in thousands of boys and girls working in city factories and sweatshops. Adams repudiated the situation, describing it, quote, as ruthlessly imposed upon by immigrant parents who, eager for money and accustomed to the patriarchal authority of peasant households, hold their children in a stern bondage, unquote. Adams related many stories of children getting into crime because of that kind of treatment. She claimed that there were frequent examples, quote, that this parental harshness often results in juvenile delinquency, unquote. She recounted that at Hull House, we, quote, learned to know many families in which the working children contributed to the support of their parents, not only because they spoke English, but because their parents gradually found it easy to live upon their earnings. An Italian father came to us in great grief over the death of his eldest child, a little girl of 12 who had brought the largest wages into the family fund. In the midst of his genuine sorrow, he said, quote, she was the oldest kid I had. Now I shall have to go back to work again until the next one is able to take care of me, unquote. After that poignant story, she declared, quote, the discovery of the labor power of youth was, to our age, like the discovery of a new natural resource. In utilizing it thus ruthlessly, we are in danger of quenching the divine fire of youth. To stop the practice, Adams called for industrial legislation that would limit child labor hours and make parents be obligated to be the main source of income. She believed that any enlightened state which regarded the industrial situation seriously would wish to conserve the ability of its youth. Adams indignantly argued, quote, we are careless in regard to the state's upbuilding and extension. We conscientiously ignore industry in relation to government. We conclude that the protection is not the concern of the government. Adams considered the state of child labor revolting, and she campaigned for governmental legislation to mandate the proper relationship between parents and children. Gilman similarly found the state of child labor appalling. She was bothered by the era's idea that parentage is a profession with a sort of mutual insurance returned to it. Gilman also objected to immigrants who used their children as the family's main source of income. Quote, among poor and degraded degraded classes, we see children early set to work for the parents instead of the parents working for the children, a position as unnatural as for a hen to eat eggs. Gilman then thought the sense of children's duty as to parents had become excessive. Finally, she provided a scathing condemnation of the issue in a poem titled, quote, Child Labor, a work that depicted factories and sweatshops as prematurely using the energy of youths. Quote, only the loving family, which we so admire, is willing to support itself on little children's hire. Only the human father, a man with power to think, will take from little children the price of food and drink. Only the human mother, degraded, helpless thing, will make her little children work and live on what they bring. We are the wisest, strongest race. Loud are many our praises be sung. The animal alive that lives upon its, the only animal alive that lives upon its young. Unquote. Gilman also wanted the proper relationship, the parents supporting the child, returned to society. Both women saw child labor and the way that parents exploited it as one of the greatest evils of their age. Addams and Gilman also castigated the lack of parents, specifically mothers' involvement in governmental legislation that involved children. The argument that Addams and Gilman put forth exemplified what historians have called municipal housekeeping, a term created to describe turn of the century women's suffrage movement's argument. Historian Aileen S. Creditor explained that by the 20th century, the suffrage movement's main strategy was expediency. Thus, the movement abandoned its 19th century argument that equal rights formed the foundation of women's suffrage because it was not winning enough support from men or women. In its place, a new argument appeared, stressing what enfranchised women could do for the government and their communities. Thus, suffragists acknowledged that the home was the woman's sphere, but they believed that the male and female spheres were not as separate as they had been in the past because governmental acts, such as passing safe food laws, affected the home. The result was that, quote, the statement that the home was the woman's sphere was now an argument not against woman's suffrage, but in favor of it, for government was now, quote, enlarged housekeeping, unquote. Municipal housekeeping was the belief that if women gained suffrage, they could use their domestic expertise to clean up the government. Wow, it's 12 o'clock already. You see here, Chicago immigrants pass the time on the sidewalk along Elburn Street. Well, it looks like I'm not going to get through. We're maybe halfway through the article, so I will have to pick it up in the next show. What I'm hoping to convey here is a sense of how the interests of the Southern racist slaveholding class coincided with the women's movement in a way that helped both. But the women's movement was used and will be used to go far beyond the original goals of the women's movement, to be used by the hidden hand by Edward Mandel House and his successors, Philip Drew, the wise administrator that sorts everything out for us, used to effect the purposes of the true elite for whom an Edward Mandel House actually is working. I look forward to reading the next part of the article because we do get to Eleanor Roosevelt, we do get to Franklin Roosevelt, and the connection to the social policies of the FDR era. So, again, this is pretty new stuff to me, and I'm fascinated by it. I hope that you find it worthwhile as well. I'll see you tomorrow with Riley Wagaman.